It was 1887, and the town of Portland, Oregon was fast approaching a population of 50,000. The new golden years of shipping and the era of international grain trading were bringing transformation to the city. The population was predominantly male, with an ample supply of saloons among the new buildings. The Morrison Street Bridge had officially opened in April. The toll rates were 5 cents for pedestrians, 10 cents for horsemen, and anywhere from 15 to 25 for vehicles with sundry. During the same time period, Dr. Emma Welty spoke passionately at a public meeting in Portland, urging concerned citizens to band together to protect young women from having to resort to prostitution in order to support themselves. She realized that with the vast growth that was occurring, the population segment most at risk were the young women who left home alone and arrived in Portland with no employment or place to live. On May 1st, 100 women, many wives of prominent businessmen, who had heard Dr. Welty's message, gathered at the Unitarian Chapel.
This is the first Unitarian church in downtown Portland at what is now Broadway and Yam Hill Streets. At that time, it was a far outpost of Portland Center, but a group of women actually banded together and started the church, and many of these same women met again in this building in 1887 to have the first meeting of the Portland Women's Union. Many of the founding members of the Portland Women's Union were also founders of the First Unitarian Church here in Portland. And included in this group is Mrs. Pittock of Pittock Mansion fame, as well as many other women who were very active in the community. And the Portland Women's Union was one of the things that they took a part in.
By the end of their meeting, they had formed the Portland Women's Union, elected their first president, and decreed their lofty purpose. In order to forward and uphold the ideals and advancement of American womanhood, to establish a hotel for self-supporting young women coming strangers to Portland, to provide counsel and assistance when necessary, and to minister to their well-being and happiness.
This is Rosa Burrell, who was the first president of the Portland Women's Union.
Mrs. Burrell was an exciting, quiet power behind the scenes, and what we know of her was just inspiring. All these women just started from scratch with a misnamed or sort of quaintly named Sewing Society, but they actually were a society that really did a lot of things for the community, and it's really exciting to see that those continue. These women were part of the vanguard that really made it happen. And they leaned on the people that had the money and said, isn't this a good idea?
Before the meeting was over, it was proposed that they open a boarding house. They purchased the children's home at 15th and Flanders, which had just been vacated for newer quarters from the Ladies' Relief Society for $2,000. The Ladies' Relief Society also paid the rent for the first year of the new boarding home. After refurbishing the building, it opened within 6 months of the newly formed union's first meeting. It was named Anna Lewis Hall, after Mrs. Mann, one of the members of the union who donated the majority of the funds for the project. Lewis had been her maiden name.
You see a picture of the first home, which was Anna Lewis Hall.
The boarding house had 4 purposes: to provide a home in the city, for protection, to provide advice and diversion, and to provide a woman with a respectable residence until she found a job or became married. The women who lived in the boarding house absolutely needed to possess what Dr. Welty called good moral character. The house opened with space for 20 guests by putting 2 in a room. They employed a manager, or superintendent as she was referred to, and provided laundry and meals. Their goals exceeded protection and physical comfort. The union provided the cultural and social benefits of a home, furnishing a library and planning programs and concerts for the residents. The union's educational committee provided the girls at the Anna Lewis popular readings on foreign travel, talks on history, lessons on good manners, information on savings banks, and general things they thought were useful for a woman to know. A list of books was provided to the residents as well. Women without home ties to the city, younger than age 25, and earning less than $12 a week were eligible to board on a sliding scale from $3 to $5. There were rules and regulations that had to be followed, such as dressing for meals, a 10 o'clock curfew, no men in the rooms, and also no emptying of slop jars out the windows. Because of the limited vocabulary at the time for reporters, the house was often referred to as an institution and the boarders as inmates. This was found offensive by the women it was intended to help, and so considerable persuasion, education, and advertising had to be done. In its first year, the Anna Lewis hosted only 51 boarders. But before long, the registry showed girls from England, Illinois, Kansas, California, Nebraska, and Ohio. They were well known in the Washington Territory and also within their own state. Financial support for the home came from public-spirited citizens. A large number donated $1 for an annual membership fee. The women of the union also put on annual balls at the Parsons Hall or Portland Hotel to meet their annual deficit. The events received good publicity, always showing up in the local paper. The women did not like having debt hanging over their heads, and they had run into some financial trouble. So, to help pay off the mortgage during the Depression of 1890, the women presented a week of grand entertainment, dinner and dancing in the old world tradition. It was held at the Exposition Building and involved 500 participants. They raised $7,000 in total proceeds, with a net income of $4,000 for the union. By their fourth annual meeting in May of 1891, with their debt under control, it was decided to expand Anna Lewis Hall. More space was urgently needed to meet the demand for the long waiting list of girls wishing to stay at the boarding house. With a legacy gift from Ella M. Smith for $5,000 and $1 contributions from the public, along with the annual flower festival and ball, they raised the money for the addition and also helped purchase more land adjoining the main home. When the annex was completed, they tripled the home's guest capacity from 20 to 60 and increased their ability to respond to more than 600 applications a year for boarders. The Finance Committee stated, "We are most comfortably furnished now, even to a degree of elegance." This was almost all donated by friends of the union, unthought of by the committee a year ago. The president's report of the time did ask the members, "Has our house accomplished its purpose? And how shall we be able to continue our work?"
In the late 19th century, you had probably at least the second generation of college-educated women who had learned a lot, had skills, had interests, and there were very few, particularly professional jobs for them to go into. And so that interest in education began to be channeled into all types of clubs and organizations, like the Portland Women's Union, the YWCA, the Portland Women's Club. There were women's clubs all over the United States at that point, and it really provided an outlet for women to organize around issues that were of importance to them. And Portland was, very much in the middle of that movement.
While the union had gotten the boarding house off the ground very quickly, because there were no organized social services to support women, they also formed various committees to address these voids. They established both Portland's first night school, which taught grammar, mathematics, and bookkeeping, and an industrial school offering gardening, sewing, and housekeeping skills. They collected money toward the hiring of a depot matron to direct young girls to respectable housing and employment, and with other social agencies, they began the Travelers' Aid Program. An employment agency was even considered at one point. Every program they developed was to enable women to be self-supporting. By 1895, the union organized the Women's Exchange. This was a somewhat more distinctive branch of the Women's Union. In its first year's work, it made $468, mostly from selling needlework. It grew to market articles and food made by the local women. The exchange began with a table in the Portland Hotel and at the YWCA. It was considered the place to eat and meet your friends. At the Exchange, working women and men and shoppers could enjoy a hot, inexpensive lunch. By 1903, the Exchange had grown to 100 consignors and established a store at 133 10th Street near Washington. The 1906 records show that one consignor received $1,056 for a 12-month period. Soon thereafter, that profitable venture was incorporated into a separate organization, relocating to 4th and Alder and lasting until the start of World War I. In 1905, Portland was the host city of the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, which was a World's Fair. The women of the Union furnished and staffed the women's restroom. The World's Fair event marked the expansion of Portland, doubling the population.
Portland and Oregon adopted the initiative and referendum in 1902, and that opened up a lot of possibilities for women to be engaged in significant ways in changing what rules and regulations governed working women and their own lives.
Population at the boarding house continued to increase as more women made their way to the city to find work. The 1909 records show that an average of 47 women lived in the Anna Lewis Hall at any given time, and the waiting list contained almost 600 names. Clearly, a new boarding house was needed, as they had outgrown the annex. The Union had also gone back to their original mission and focused solely on the running of the boarding house. The Union was run as an all-volunteer membership organization. Since it was only $1 to become a member, there were many members throughout the city. The many affairs were managed by the women themselves, and one of their goals was always to meet all of their expenses. They also had the good fortune to have a fair amount of property to their name.
As the Progressive era gained momentum in the early 20th century, Portland was then very equipped to engage in using the initiative and referendum for things like getting the right to vote. The suffrage issue had been on the ballot many times, but once they could use the initiative and referendum, 1912 was finally the successful campaign. And once women had the vote in the state, the male politicians needed to pay more attention to that, and so instead of just having women's clubs and committees, they could now actually regulate or get changes into the laws. And one of the first ones that happened was the nation's first enforceable minimum wage law was passed in 1913, and the women and men that worked on that considered the fact that women had the right to vote an element in the success of that.
This is part of the Portland Women's Union collection here at the Oregon Historical Society. This is one of the scrapbooks in the collection. It was started around 1904. And this is Anna Lewis Mann, who donated much of the property on which the various homes were built, including the Martha Washington.
By 1911, the Union acquired the quarter block at the corner of 10th and Montgomery for the site of their new boarding house through the generosity of Mrs. Mann, who provided, from various reports, a sum of between $14,000 or $15,000 towards the purchase price. However, $75,000 was still needed to complete the project, so fundraising began. Mrs. Elliott R. Corbett, then the president of the Union, along with her finance committee, set off to get contributions from friends to start the new building fund. A.E. Doyle was chosen as the architect, and soon plans were underway. At the Union's 25th annual meeting, they had paid off all of their debt and had a balance in the treasury, which made the fundraising easier for the new project. Then a fire at Anna Lewis Hall in 1916 made the new building even more of a necessity. The superintendent of the house had detected the odor of smoke but could not discover the reason for it. She sent for the fire department to come and investigate, and they discovered the roof on fire. It appeared to have been started by a skyrocket set off on the 4th of July.
The country was becoming a much more urban nation, and as jobs on the farm and family farms couldn't support the family anymore, there was much more migration of young women and men into cities. And for women, this was a fairly new experience. And because women weren't in the workforce in ways that they had been before, there were all kinds of changes that were necessitated: housing, wages, types of jobs that they were allowed to work at or not work at.
The union's first president, Mrs. Burrell, had left a gift of $10,000 that was used towards the new building, which was now being called the Martha Washington. Mrs. Corbett and her finance committee were successful in raising $35,000 through a plea to the public, and $30,000 was borrowed from Penn Mutual. The cornerstone was laid on January 29, 1917, in wet falling snow. In the small group that braved the storm were a number of Portland's best-known women. A metal box containing the records of the Union and a few other documents were placed in the stone. President Mrs. Comstock sealed the box with a trowel of mortar. The 4-story Martha Washington Hotel for Self-Supporting Women opened on October 21, 1917, as home to 90 female boarders, with more classrooms, common areas, and even a gymnasium. The dedication and the 30th anniversary of the Union were celebrated during a reception in the hotel's living room. Mrs. Piddock and Mrs. Mann were front and center, enjoying the Union's accomplishment.
Because of the influx of young single women into cities, places like the Martha Washington that accommodated only women tenants were very welcome. They had affordable rents, they were safe, congenial places for these young women to live with other women who were sharing their experiences. And so it was a real boon when the Martha Washington opened in 1917. And this was a very central location, and so it was easy for young women to go to work and do the kinds of recreation that they might want to do outside of work on their weekends.
The new location also brought everything new with it. New furnishings all the way down to the pillowcases, a new set of rules for the residents, and even the housekeeping staff had new requirements. By 1920, the Martha Washington Hotel housed 95 women, and more than 200 women's names appeared on a waiting list. While the Union now owned the new Martha at 10th and Montgomery, they still owned the old home at 15th and Flanders and 2 lots on West Main Street, another gift from Mrs. Mann. This caused a strain on their finances, but by 1922, when Anna Lewis Hall was finally sold, the proceeds eased the Union's financial outlook.
By 1924, the waiting list for women to board here was so extensive that they expanded and added an annex that would then allow another 170 women boarders to live here. One of the changes that happened for women really was World War I. And during that time, although to a lesser degree than World War II, men went off to war, women stepped into jobs that they had not previously held. And that trend continued through the 20s and into the early 30s. The Depression played a role in that as well. And so where women might have just had clerical jobs or been domestics, they really branched out into a broader range of industrial and office jobs.
At the 50th anniversary of the Union, celebrated in 1937, the women presented a comparison of the residents and how they had operated for the past 50 years. Not only had the occupations changed, but the educational backgrounds from the first residents who had had very limited schooling now had college degrees, and even a number held masters and PhDs. They even looked at the food service over the years and noted the ignorance of nutrition back in the later 1800s, the absence of vegetables except for potatoes, and it seemed rhubarb was the only fruit listed. There had been a very high starch content in the early menus. On the 50th anniversary, the women of the Union also celebrated that the Martha Washington was once again entirely free of debt.
I met Helen because she was volunteering with us. She was very involved in a church, and they made knit items for our clients. many of the women who were knitting were older, and it was very important for them to be knitting for other women. And she had heard and read in the newsletter that I was doing a lot of advocacy work and really trying to persuade the county to open the Martha Washington again, this beautiful, precious building, this gem. And she shared with me, well, Susan, I lived at the Martha Washington when I first moved to Portland. And so she told me her story, and I was just so fascinated by this. She was born in 1915. She lived in a very small town in eastern Oregon, and the Martha Washington was considered a safe and genteel place for a young woman coming to Portland, finding her way to live. And her parents brought her to town, and it was 1937. And so she lived at the Martha Washington. She had trained as a secretary and a bookkeeper, and she worked in a downtown firm for a number of years until she met her husband and married. But it was so fascinating to me, I've been working in this field since 1985, to meet someone so many years later after I'd started working and watch the Martha Washington go through so many transformations, to meet a person who started out her life as a single woman, and this was the first place that she lived outside of her parents' home.
The Martha Washington Hotel's tenancy grew or dwindled as each decade brought new challenges and changes, depending largely on the political and world events of the time. During the Great Depression, the rents were lowered and rules were loosened in order to allow older women to live there. During World War II, the Martha Washington Hotel was home to war workers, and women over the age of 30 were asked to leave. After the war ended, the national emphasis was on women leaving their jobs to return home and become wives and mothers. The Martha reiterated this theme by stressing that its tenants were welcome to stay until they were married. By the early 40s, the hotel registry reflected a good number of residents from Oregon, but also continued to get an influx from out of state as well. The hotel served as a location in 1947 of the Union's 60th anniversary. The women were always ensuring that the hotel had an updated brochure and made great efforts to keep the quality of the hotel in tip-top condition. This was an ongoing job for the household committee, and keeping it to a high standard was no easy task. 1953 found 13 women who had come to look upon Martha as their home. There was such a demand for boarding that on January 26, 1953, the union had to make a motion and draft a legal letter to ask the older women to vacate. New rules were put in place that the age limits were to be from 18 to 20 years old, with a time limit of 3 years occupancy and a 1-year extension for a student completing a college course. They reviewed the many reports up to this time that all stressed the word young and the term girls. In 1954, a new Martha was once again presented to the public with a marketing brochure and an open house.
I lived in the Martha Washington in 1965, and I had moved here from Utah. I didn't know anyone, and I had heard about it before I came, and I had to wait 3 months to get in. And then when I got in, it was great because all of a sudden I had all these friends, and there's 5 of us who became lifelong friends. We're like sisters. Some of the things I liked about the Martha was it was affordable, like $80 a month at the time I was there. I could walk to work. They served breakfast and lunch. And then we just always had a social calendar because of our friends. Yes, when we were living there in 1965, so one of the fun things was there was a group of women who were at the desk, and they were the buffer, or they would, if someone came to visit, they would call us in our rooms. And sometimes they would just be saviors to us because a salesman may have approached us and made us have an appointment, and the women would sort of get rid of them for us, and so we felt safe. We knew that they'd take care of us if someone was kind of taking advantage of us. The 1960s brought a new look to the city as well as the Martha.
And even though the skirt lengths were much shorter, the residents were still known as wholesome girls. The residents created a list of what they liked about the Martha and shared it with the Union. But the 60s also brought about a culture of change. Young women were much more independent, and the Martha still had a rule about no men upstairs. In the April report of 1967, spring had sprung, with the girls breaking the rules by bringing male guests upstairs and having water fights.
By 1969, Portland State was expanding its campus, and the Martha Washington was sitting right in the middle of the places that they wanted to expand, and they needed room for their own students to have lodging. And so the Portland Women's Union began to seek a new home, which they found at 11th and Main in what was originally called the Campbell Court Hotel. It had been a residential hotel built by Jean Campbell and run by her for many years.
With the Portland Development Commission's purchase of the Martha for Portland State University to use for dorms, Martha was on the move. The now new Martha opened its doors at the beginning of 1970. New marketing materials were once again created to show off its beautiful features, and a new ad was created and placed in the paper touting the modern downtown appeal and the low rates, from $100 to $120 with meals and many amenities. There was a beautiful sitting room, outside courtyard, and a very nice dining room.
By the 1960s and 70s, American culture was changing significantly. The women's rights movement was in full swing, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War. While economics may have interested women in the rates that were offered at the Martha Washington, the lack of men accessible in the building and the rules and regulations of the Martha didn't quite fit with the new freedoms that women enjoyed and wanted to pursue at that time.
The once desirable residents started to see vacancy rates from 15 to 60% over the next decade, and the Martha was incurring annual operating losses.
By the 1980s, there was just such low occupancy that decisions had to be made about what the future of the Martha Washington was going to be. Restrictions of women tenants had just become too unattractive to most young women.
The nation was also experiencing double-digit inflation. For the Martha, food costs soared, repair bills increased, and the utility bills were almost impossible to predict. Another obstacle the union was also facing were stricter IRS rule enforcements that stated that in order for them to maintain their tax-free status, the Martha must adhere to HUD guidelines of low-income women. Any woman living at the Martha could not earn more than $12,000 a year. As a result, the Martha mostly attracted students, and since they went home during the summer months, this resulted in often having only 50 to 60 people in the hotel at a given time. They needed to have 110 to 114 to maintain an adequate cash flow. There were just some plain hard facts in trying to run low-income housing. People on food stamps wouldn't rent because the food service feature meant they would lose their food stamp benefits. Downtown low-income housing appealed to the elderly and disabled persons because of the prime location. And to appeal to this group, the Martha would have to do a remodel that would not only be expensive, but the low-interest loans were not available to the union. The Martha was struggling to survive. The results of changing social patterns, the economic marketplace, and the government programs and subsidies meant a decision had to be made. There were two schools of thought among the union membership as to what to do with the hotel. One felt that the hotel should be sold and the funds from the sale could go to establish a charitable foundation. This group felt they could do more good for more people using their resources for other projects. The other felt that since there was such a need for low-income housing downtown, that they should make the upgrades and change the rules about the type of women they catered to. A very public debate took place and was played out in the papers. Both groups also sought out new members so they could gain more voting power. the group that wanted to keep the hotel and catered to a new clientele even launched the Save the Martha campaign. At a tense meeting on November 16, 1981, the union members were asked to support revisions to the constitution of the organization to make possible the sale of the Martha.
And so the decision was finally made to sell the hotel. And the buyer that came forward was the religious organization, or cult as some people call them, of the Rajneeshis.
The vote came back to put the Martha up for sale, and the process began. On June 13, 1983, the real estate chair of the union reported that Portland State University had to cancel their negotiations to buy the Martha Washington Hotel in the fall of 1982, and the realty firm of Bullier & Bullier was chosen to now help find prospective buyers. In January of 1983, an offer from the Rajneesh was finally accepted for $1.4 million, using 3 Rolls-Royces from his fleet as collateral. The union actually carried the loan themselves. The union had also made a decision to retain rights to the name the Martha Washington Hotel.
In the 1980s, the girlfriends and I that lived in the former Martha Washington went to visit our house mother at the new location. And we were just reminiscing about all the fun that we had had when we were living there. And then she shared with us that they were going to have to close down, that girls didn't want to live in that type of housing anymore, and they just weren't making it financially, so they were going to close down, which made us so sad because we had had so much fun there, and it was just such a, it's just like home, really.
All seemed well as the union started a charitable trust to help the pressing needs of women in the community. By May 1984, they had completed their first year operating as the Portland Women's Charitable Foundation. But by September 1986, since the union was carrying the loan for the Rajneeshis themselves, there was an indication that something was amiss when the union received a notice that the fire insurance on the hotel had been canceled. The union was able to get the policy extended to Christmas Eve, but with the gap for the new policy that wouldn't start until January, Ann Pierce, then president of the union, had to help patrol the building along with a team of firefighters from the Rajneeshis ranch to ensure nothing happened to the building, since the union still had a vested interest in the property. Then there was worry that the payments to the union might also be in jeopardy, but a call from the union's attorney later that January let them know that a $50,000 balloon payment had indeed been made, but it had also been a future sign of trouble for the Hotel Rajneesh. In 1986, the Rajneesh Investment Corporation sold the hotel building to Multnomah County, which used it as a work release center for county offenders until 2003. The Rajneesh Corporation paid the union the balance of the monies due. The hotel was no longer the responsibility of the union.
So I joined the Northwest Pilot Project in 1985 and started to notice the loss of buildings downtown, and I believed that we really needed an organization that would track how we were losing all these buildings and what they were. And one year, a reporter from the Oregonian contacted me and asked permission to publish my graveyard map. And I said, graveyard map? I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, your map of downtown Portland with all the crosses on it. So this is the map, and it's a bit crude. It's not high tech, certainly, but every cross represents a building that we've lost since 1978. It may be the building no longer exists, it may be that it was transformed to another use, or it may be that the rents went up drastically. But at one time, the Martha Washington was represented on this map as a building that we've lost.
In 2010, the stately Martha Washington unveiled a stylish new look in a special grand opening ceremony on Wednesday, June 16th, 7 years after being closed. During her lifetime, the Martha Washington Hotel has served as a women's boarding house, a commune, a county restitution center, and now was beginning a new life once again in housing low-income women and others in need. The foundation licensed the name to the new project, bringing the union's full circle.